This is Albert Campa. Once again, thanks for listening. And so for today's episode, it's story time. And to begin this story of a Mexican American life, let's get some context and go to the Twitters. Previously, in some interaction, we see our good friend Cesar Hernandez talks about the Rodolfo Pizarro to Miami uh, transfer and purchase that happened, and he says, just a bunch of stuff. Then Michelada says there is only one fan on Twitter. We shall wait for their response. Okay, this is irrelevant stuff, but let's get down to the meat. Francisco says there's lots of fans on Twitter. The Twitter community is actually really fun. And then I chime in saying, okay, he meant Pocho Twitter. Pocho Twitter is different than Mexican Twitter. Pocho Twitter is in English, and you don't see too many Monterrey fans in English talking about Rayados. But in Mexico, you do see a lot of that, especially from Rayados and Tigres fans. They go at it back and forth in Spanish, and there's a lot of that in Twitter. In Pocho Twitter or in Mexican American Twitter, there's not that much. And then this guy, this is the meat of it. Rayado Tejano replies, "If anything, you are the Pocho." And I reply, "E." So let's talk about this. He seems to think that, you are the Pocho being meant as the insult. Like, here, take this insult. You are a Pocho. You are a Mexican American. Boom, roasted. You've been insulted. And I respond with, E. This guy admittedly is in his name, Rayado Tejano. So he's a Texan. Oh, so he's either, not even Mexican, not even Mexican American. He's pure Texan, or he's an American. He just happens to be a fan of Rayados. So, okay, so let's talk about Pocho. Let's talk about this podcast name. Let's talk about Mexican Americans. Let's talk about, Americans from Mexican descent. The whole purpose of this podcast is to get a glimpse of what a Mexican American is, the experiences that are had, and how that translates into different types of interests and sports, and specifically soccer, because soccer is a main part of my current existence and life right now. But is it an insult? If I call you a pocho, are you going to be offended? If I call you a Mexican American, are you going to be offended? If I call you an American, are you going to be offended? If I call you a Mexican, are you going to be offended? So it just happens to be a certain individual in this Twitter thread, Twitter conversation, refers to himself as Mexican, born in the United States, but referred, when he goes to Mexico, or even in the United States, if he's asked, he'll say, "Yes, I'm Mexican. I'm Mexican." Okay, so there's a certain thing in the Mexican American community, a certain pride that I think we all have, but more so with the Mexican Americans, with Mexicans, a pride of where they're from. We see this a lot, and I've talked about this a lot as far as soccer, but pride of being a Mexican. If you're in the United States, you speak Spanish, you are born in the United States, but your parents are from Mexico, you are proud to be of Mexican descent, and proud to be you can say you're a Mexican. You go to Mexico and you might not speak perfect English, you might not, have your Mexican citizenship, you might not vote every time in Mexico, you might not even spend time very much in Mexico, but in the United States you consider yourself, and in Mexico you consider yourself a Mexican. You identify as a Mexican. Anything other than that is, you're an American. Oh, you're an American. Oh, you're a Mexican American. You can't sport that Hecho en Mexico little tag, like you were raised in Mexico, even though you no longer live there. You left there. Your parents left there, whatnot. So Pocho, I do not see that as an insult. I do not see that as degrading. That's just the way you are. Everyone's different. This dude's a Pocho. people who think they're Mexican or who name themselves Mexican but are born in the United States, I would say, sure, you're a Mexican. If a Mexican says, no, you're not, you're an American, okay, you're an American because you are. You're both. You're Mexican American, you're a Pocho also. Nothing wrong with it. Nothing wrong with being a Pocho. I said it. So let's talk a little bit about my Pocho lifestyle, my Pocho life, which is very unique than what we've interviewed so far. A lot of the Mexican American or the Mexican community in soccer are in concentrated Mexican cities like Los Angeles, like New York, like Texas, Arizona, near the border, places where lots of Mexicans are, where lots of Mexican national team, Mexican soccer fans are and exist. So my story is unique, and you're not going to hear. I'm going to try to find some people to interview that are similar to my story, but I did not grow up around Mexicans at all. I grew up, I guess, starting at the age of around 10, 11, 12. I grew up in northern Florida. So I say northern Florida because it's not southern Florida, it's not Cuban Florida, it's not the diversity that's, Miami or Orlando. This is northern Florida. And to better give you a description of what northern Florida is, let's call where I grew up southern Alabama. There you go. I grew up in southern Alabama, the panhandle of Florida. So there were no Mexicans. I didn't grow up with Mexican friends, Mexican kids. I grew up with white friends and black friends. That's it. I grew up around a culture of redneck dudes with gun racks in their trucks and black dudes who, you know, did their thing, lived in their neighborhood, but, it was a coexistence in the deep south, we could call it. Now, in high school, I do recall various incidents of brawls and fights between players and racial fights between players on the football team. There was one incident, but for the most part, everything was cool. I had friends that were white, friends that were black, uh, and and so it was, everything was, it was fine. I grew up in middle school at this location as well, playing soccer. I played soccer all throughout middle school, played on rec teams, and then in high school, played soccer as well. Played uh, traveling team, and soccer was, my favorite sport. I loved it. I loved playing it. I had good talent. I thought I had good technical abilities, whereas the other people who were more brutish, you see the typical American that had physical skills, but not necessarily technique. That was very well on display. I had the technique. A lot of these other dudes had uh, good physical skills, good strength, and speed, but the technique was not fully there. So in this environment, I did not grow up watching professional soccer. MLS was barely even around. The U.S. national team, was the U.S. national team not very huge at all. The Mexican national team or Liga MX was never on TV, so I didn't grow up watching these teams. My dad put me in soccer because he enjoyed it for me, and I was attracted to it, and uh, it stuck with me. My parents spoke Spanish themselves, but they did not speak to us. We did not learn Spanish. We learned certain words, and so that's the thing. That's the way it was. It was a decision on their part, and that's I respect that. Eventually, I did get into a little bit of the international soccer scene. I was a fan of Roberto Baggio. I had a poster of him. I had a poster of some of the players on the Dutch team, like Rijkaard and uh, and uh, and several others. I enjoyed watching, the World Cup in '94, and was able to, enjoy a little bit of soccer, but never the U.S. national team. Not really even the Mexican national team. So at that time, after high school, I decided to go on a church mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I was assigned to go to live 2 years in Mexico, in Leon area. And I spent 2 years living there, walking, talking, teaching about religion, about Christ to the Mexican people. Now, this is a shock because I look sort of Mexican, right? Being in Mexico and then all of a sudden not being able to speak Spanish or speak Spanish not very well at the beginning was quite odd, right? People were like, what is this? What's going on? It was a struggle. I had to identify, I had to struggle, I had to, you know, try to perfect and fool people with my Spanish eventually. And one of the main things I was able to obtain was a guy telling me that, asking me if I was from Colombia because of my accent, which was better than being from the United States. So, you know, I didn't have the full gringo accent. I tried my best to get a little bit better and, be able to, fool a little bit the people with my accent based on my appearance. So during this time was very important because I spent time in Leon, I spent time in Celaya, I spent time in uh, Moroleón, in San Luis Potosí, Aguascalientes, and got a good experience of fellow Mexicans, of the people of Mexico, and began, as most missionaries do, began to love the people there. It was a little bit different because these people, I saw them as my people, people that I identify with, that looked like me, that had my interests. I fell in love with the food, which I'd already had a lot with my grandparents and with my mom. A lot of the food was familiar, but everything was just perfect. The friends that I made there gave me a Mexican national team jersey, so I began to be attracted to the Mexican national team. After I was done, I went and visited my cousins in Mexico City, and they were UNAM graduates and showed me around the university, and I began to be more interested uh, in Pumas, in UNAM, in the Mexican League, just a little bit. And so when I returned back to the United States, that passion and that love for Mexico and anything Mexican was just super great, and I wanted that to exist in my life from then on. So my experience in becoming a little bit more into the Mexican culture is a little bit different than most. But this experience happens to, I think, in general, a very little amount of people. I've already talked about the guy with the experience with Mexican food, about hating his mom's Mexican food, and he grew up in California where there's Mexicans all around. This is a little bit different. This is a little bit harder of a possibility to be attracted to the Mexican culture where I grew up in southern Alabama, where there was no Mexicans at all. I had to go to Mexico to feel that passion and then come back and continue it on in my life. I eventually got more into professional soccer. Freddie Adu came on the scene, and I got more attracted to MLS. Uh, then the whole United States versus Mexico rivalry came on in 2002, and I sided immediately with Mexico, Mexican national team. The U.S. as a country, I live here. I love it. It's great. But as a soccer nation, I've seen it growing up. When I was in high school, the coach for our soccer team was a football coach, knew nothing about soccer. He eventually got a little bit of help, but that help was mediocre or worst, mediocre at best. So this is not at all a soccer place, and my reflection of that was even the United States is the same as a whole. It was not a soccer place. So if I'm going to be a fan of a soccer nation, I would choose Mexico because I lived there, because of the love of the people, but also because the technique was similar to mine. The technique of a Mexican player was similar to mine. I looked at myself as the same as like a Jorge Campos or a Alberto Medina type of thin, quick, skillful on the ball, but not some brute strong, Gooch Onyewu type of guy that's just a center back in the middle, busting people up, which I experienced going against in high school. I was not that person, so I identified with the play, the tactics of the Mexican national team more so than a Brian McBride or a Eddie Pope in the United States national team. And that's transmitted on even into league teams such as the Liga MX and Pumas, America, Chivas, and all that became more of a passion and more of a thing to follow than MLS. The Freddie Adu thing was more of a joke. This young kid who was supposed to be the next big thing turned out to be a flop. The rivalry between the US and the Mexico after 2002 became really intense. So there was this more of a separation versus the Americans in the whole realm of soccer. Now, I don't go as far as to say, and this is where, things get iffy back on the Twitter. How dare you call me a pocho? How dare you call me, uh, you know, an American? I'm a Mexican, man. I'm more Mexican than you. I eat chile. I eat, here's my picture of my tacos that I love so much. Here's my picture of my horchata that I'm drinking. But you know what? I'm speaking English. I'm using a, fancy iPhone that I bought with my hard-earned dollars. I live in the United States. I won't go back to Mexico and live because my comfort is too great here and all this. So, you might go to the national team, pay, hundreds of dollars for tickets to watch the national team play in the United States and, not even see the starters maybe it's sometimes. So basically what I'm saying is in my story as a Mexican American, as a pocho, which I have no problem with being called one, or a gringo even. Like I go to Mexico sometimes they call me gringo because I'm from the United States. Now, is a unique one in that I wasn't surrounded by Mexican culture, by full-on Spanish speaking, by Mexican soccer, by even soccer, or boxing, like a common sport in Mexico, boxing, soccer, baseball. I very much grew up the American way. Typically, when I say American way, I say things that are popular. I grew up watching NBA. I was a Chicago Bulls fan. I grew up watching the Denver Broncos. I love John Elway and their wide receivers and the things that they did. I enjoyed the New York Yankees. I watched baseball. A lot of American aspects is the way I grew up. But that one moment in time spent in Mexico with the culture, with the soccer, changed the trajectory of my life. And that's a unique situation that doesn't happen to everyone, especially in an environment such as mine in southern Alabama. Very hard for that to happen for Mexican Americans who are living and born in that type of an environment. More probable for it to happen if you live in California or on the border, where it's all around you, where you see Mexican markets all around you, where you see Mexican stores all around you. But it's still even in those environments we see that it has happened. I've shown video of Dominic Reyes from the UFC who lives and grew up in California but does not speak Spanish, played football growing up. You can be around all these. The guy that I talked about with the tacos with his food that did not like Mexican food until all of a sudden he had a specific experience that changed his whole route in his life, that changed his whole attitude. Those things do not happen for every Mexican American that grows up, for every pocho that grows up, and they become a gringo, they become an American. It's more probable to assimilate into the American way of things, the most popular things in the United States, which does not happen to be soccer, which does not happen to be, a lot of times menudo or deep cultural Mexican things. Like, sure, tacos. You see a Mexican go to Taco Bell and be like, yeah, I love me some tacos, I go to Taco Bell. Other types of Mexicans would be, what are you doing? It all goes back to the Shea Serrano. The Mexicans are perfect. He posted a little Tex-Mex slop of Mexican food, and people are like, "What the heck is this?" and making fun of him because there's elitism that Mexicans have, and the insulting of you are not as Mexican or you're not authentic as a Mexican. And that's where people get the whole pocho thing and this insult comes into play. But, My explanation is this. There's nothing wrong with being a Pocho. You are a Pocho. Even if you want to get all holy, if you cross to Mexico, you were born in Mexico and you've lived in Mexico for the majority of the years of your life, even though you were born in Mexico, I would say you're not even Mexican. I would even call you a Pocho because you do not live in Mexico. And people that are in the United States being proud of how Mexican they are, why don't you go and live in Mexico? Support Mexican with a business, support, give jobs back to Mexico, give something back to your country instead of looking out for yourself and being comfortable in the United States. Now everyone's free to do whatever they want, but if you want to get all high and mighty about who's Mexican, who's not Mexican, and are you real Mexican or not Mexican, then think about all the aspects of it. And that's what the purpose of this podcast was. There's nothing wrong with being a Pocho, nothing wrong with being a Mexican American, nothing wrong with being a Mexican, nothing wrong with living in the United States, nothing wrong at all with living in Mexico all your life and struggling and fighting it out and, staying in Mexico. And then again, there's nothing wrong with leaving Mexico, finding something better, finding something for your family. So this is the discussion that I like to have on this podcast and will continue to have. Want to have more interviews with different people, different experiences. Trying to find some more experiences that are similar to mine. Get some interviews. It's sort of hard to find. One guy I know from LA, we might have an LA, growing up in LA experience. It might be my next podcast or coming up in the future. It's unique. LA is a big city. Each person's childhood of growing up in Los Angeles could be different, and we want to get that aspect as well. So stay tuned. We'll see you guys later. Thanks for listening.